Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, c'est avec beaucoup de plaisir que je vous accueille à l'Université Carleton. It is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest speaker for the first event of this year's Ambassador Speaker Series. The High Commissioner of South Africa, Her Excellency Sibongiseni Dlamini-Mntambo, is going to be, as I said, the first speaker for this year's event. Larry Lederman organizes these events every year, about 4 of them each year, and we're happy that we can continue this collaboration with him. Her Excellency is going to speak after I give a brief introduction of what she has achieved and her various accomplishments. Her Excellency has a BA in Communication Science and a master's degree in Business Leadership. She also has a university diploma in education from the University of South Africa. After beginning a career as a teacher in South Africa, she left teaching, unlike some of us, and entered the field of communications, marketing, and advertising, working in the mining and metals industry. She was also the Public Affairs and Communications Advisor for the Chamber of Mines of South Africa, where she helped to develop a national growth strategy for the mining industry. Later, the High Commissioner joined the government of South Africa, where she has held several positions in the Department of Economic Affairs and Tourism, the Department of Minerals and Energy, and the Department of Higher Education and Training. As a member of the Independent Electoral Commission, she's also managed the communication and marketing campaigns for South Africa's 2004 and 2006 elections. Prior to joining the Department of International Relations and Cooperation in 2016, she was a consultant in the management and public relations sector. The High Commissioner has also been involved in humanitarian work as a trustee of a non-profit organization in South Africa while contributing to the well-being of the neediest children from underprivileged backgrounds. Please join me in welcoming the High Commissioner of South Africa, Sibongiseni Dlamini-Mntambo.
Thank you so much. Dean Public Affairs, Dr. Andre Ploche, Professor Teddy Semi, Lawrence, David Lederman, Chair of the Ambassador Speaker Series, Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, members of the Diplomatic Corps, special guests, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know whether I should thank the organizers of this event for putting me through 3 weeks of hell. For quite some time now, my stomach has been churning in anticipation of this event. I was okay until I learned that some in the audience here today are academics, and I have thought of nothing else but my audience in colorful robes, gowns, hoods, piercing eyes above the low-hanging glasses, sliding down the noses. Teachers of the highest academic rank at university who have been awarded titles of doctorates and professorship. My goodness, what have I subjected myself to? It was only last week that I foolishly told myself that it will be okay. This after I came across a quote by Chair where she says, "Until you are ready to look foolish, you'll never have the possibility of being great." Chair, out of all people. So it is in this light that I thank the organizers for inviting me to be this evening's speaker on the series of talks, thus giving me an opportunity to possibly become great one day. Honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Sanbonani, Goeienaand. We, the people of South Africa, recognize the injustices of our past. We honor those who suffered justice and freedom in our land. We respect those who have worked to build and develop our country. And we believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a very important section in the preamble of our Constitution. And it is particularly relevant today because of our discussion celebrating South Africa's diversity. South Africa has a unique an inspiring story to tell. A story filled with tragedy and triumph. A story of horror and humiliation and humility. My discussion will start at the end of our recent history, where we are today as a country. Thereafter, I will dive into our history so that I give context into how we arrived at this point. How the world helped to shape us, to shape the destiny of South Africa. And I will also look at the role that Canada played in the battle against apartheid. Thereafter, I will look at the need to transform our economy, and finally conclude by highlighting why we celebrate our diversity as a country. Ladies and gentlemen, South Africa is today grounded in its constitution. Upon its adoption in 1996, it was lauded as one of the most progressive constitutions in the world. This is probably due to the lines like those from our Bill of Rights, which states that the state may not unfairly discriminate directly or indirectly against anyone on one or more grounds, including race, gender, sex, pregnancy, marital status, ethnic or social origin, color, sexual orientation, age, disability, religion, conscience, belief, culture, language, and birth. So exactly who are we? And what is this diversity that we keep on talking about? At the southern tip of Africa, flanked on the west by the cold Atlantic Ocean, on the east, the warmer Indian Ocean, is South Africa, with a population of about 55.9 million, of which the majority is 80.7%, and they could be classified as Black Africans. 8.8% are coloureds, that is mixed race, 8.1% that's whites, and 2.5% that is Asian or Indian. South Africa is a country with 11 official languages, and the three most spoken are Zulu at 22%, 22.7%, isiXhosa 16%, and Afrikaans at 13.5%. Let me hasten to say that although English is the fourth most spoken first language at 9.6%, it is the second language of the majority of South Africans. So if you have booked a holiday to South Africa, don't panic and run to chapters to buy phrase books. You will be able to communicate with most South Africans. We are a society which holds various religious beliefs. Christianity is followed by almost 80% of the population. Other major followers of religion include Muslims at 1.5%, Hindu at 1.2%, and Jews 0.2%. South Africa is a parliamentary representative democratic republic. The president serves as both the head of state and as head of government, and elected by National Assembly. Citizens are free to join any political party, and they freely exercise their democratic right to elect a party of their choice. Home for South Africans is a country with 4 main population groups spread over 9 provinces, who are united and proud of the country's diverse, breathtaking landscapes, which boasts iconic mountains, canyons, waterfalls, winding rivers, valleys, and fields and more fields of wildflowers, the varying coastline of the warm Indian and cold Atlantic Ocean, which matches no other. Equally, they are extremely proud of their country's wildlife, the Big Five, and of course, we tolerate the mosquito. It too has a claim in the bigger scheme of things. That, in a nutshell, is who we are. A people made up of various races, cultures, beliefs. We officially speak 11 languages, but in reality, much more. one nation, none more South African than another. Let's look at yesterday. Ladies and gentlemen, our history is a wrenching pain and sheer disbelief that unethical, immoral acts of cruelty and discrimination by one race over another were institutionalized and passed as laws. It is even more alarming and ironic that the custodians of these laws were settlers or immigrants, and they imposed them on the citizens of the country. During my school days, the first lessons in history began with the telling of the arrival of dromedaries and Goede Hoop, mighty ships which landed in the Cape, carrying Jan van Riebeeck, a Dutch East Company employee who arrived from the Netherlands in 1652 to establish a refreshment station for ships passing Cape Town. The true story of South Africa, the true history of South Africa, does not begin with the written history of being discovered in 1652. It does not begin with being discovered in 1652 with the arrival of Europeans. Mrs. Bless, pictured here, is a 2 million year old humanoid fossil found just outside Pretoria that proves that there had been life in South Africa long before the first Europeans arrived. We also had Khoisans. The once proud kingdom of Mapungubwe may have been wiped from my history books, but it stood in South Africa 1,000 years ago, trading with nations in the East. The Dutch arrived in 1652, the British arrived in 1820. The South African War between the descendants of the Dutch, the Afrikaners, and the English followed. The Land Act of 1913 stripped the indigenous population of the right to own land and effectively handed 90% of South Africa's land to 20% of the population. The indigenous people were shoved to the 10% of the land, which was neither arable nor had any known mineral deposits. Racial segregation and white supremacy became central aspects of the South African policies. In the late 1940s, those of European descent under the National Party devised and introduced apartheid into law. Apartheid, a system whose goal was not only to separate South Africa's white minority from its non-white majority, but also to separate non-whites from each other and to divide black South Africans along tribal lines in order to decrease their power, their political power. The system progressively disenfranchised the indigenous black people. It stripped them of their dignity, curtailing their rights, their citizenship, and they could not vote in their country. Repressive laws like the Group Areas Act, Separate Amnesties Act, and the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act were introduced to control the movement of the indigenous people, now deemed non-citizens. The most disabling act of the apartheid system was when its clause extended to the education space, suppressing whatever glimpse of hope or dreams there was for a black child. Bantu education was introduced to shape the future of a black child for the lower echelons of the labor market. Hendrik Verwoerd, the architect of apartheid, who was South Africa's Minister of Native Affairs from 1958 to 1966, addressing Parliament on government's education policies said, I quote, "There is no place for Bantu in the European community above the level of certain forms of labor. What is the use of teaching the Bantu child mathematics when it cannot use it in practice? Education must train people in accordance to the sphere in which they live." I close quotes. As I speak to you today, I'm sure you can tell from some of my pronunciation that I am a product of that Bantu education, but I'm not ashamed. Like most other South Africans, we are proud of what we have achieved today. We have defeated the system. And today I am addressing diplomats, doctors, and I understand they are professors as well. In every space we find ourselves in, we will continue to unravel the legacy of apartheid. The vindictiveness of the Bantu education system and the degrading comments in reference to blacks and attempts to keep the black child away from school made Chief Albert Luthuli, President of the African National Congress from 1952 to 1960, and the first African who in 1960 received the Nobel Peace Prize, to comment that, I quote, "Take every opportunity to present us in the world as subhuman beings, incapable of assimilating civilization. This matter of dwarfing our personality and trying to make us believe that we are nobodies is the worst sin the white man has committed against Africans." Of course, some countries had similar segregation mechanisms, but South Africa, it took it to a different level of extreme. Racial discrimination was institutionalized, and it touched every aspect of our existence, excluding non-whites from the economy. The control of the economy was firmly in the white hands, and the oppression of the indigenous population had become entrenched and deeply systematic. So, understanding how the system was enforced will make you understand why the apartheid legacy has been so enduring 23 years after democracy. Let's look at international condemnation. With the barrel of a gun, military occupation, violent suppression of protest, and threats of imprisonment became the order of the day. Many of our people were exiled. Some were jailed, some were murdered, and some of our people, even to this day, cannot be accounted for. With the domestic and international pressure mounting, South Africa faced international condemnation. The Organization of African Unity, for example, demanded sanctions against South Africa. Pope John Paul II added his voice, and many other institutions and individuals as well. The Sharpeville massacre of 69 black people on the 21st of March 1960 made the UN to reconsider its stance about South Africa's membership, declaring apartheid as a crime against humanity. South Africans during that time lived under a censored media. Only those who managed to leave our borders were able to grasp how many friends we had abroad. We saw the display of the spirit and philosophy of Ubuntu from other nations. I am a person because you are. That was Ubuntu. We remember and appreciate how our humanity was recognized by so many of our African neighbors and countries across our great continent. We made those our home. African countries who sheltered our liberators when others called them criminals or tourists. For this, South Africa is forever indebted to you. We appreciate the role that was played by some countries abroad, but given my limited time, I would now like to focus on the role that Canada played during our struggle. It was not a coincidence that immediately after his release from prison, Nelson Mandela listed Canada as one of the priority countries to visit. In June 1990, 4 months after 27 years of imprisonment, Nelson Mandela, a non-head of state, addressed a joint session of the House of Commons and the Senate here in Canada. In his address, he said, and I quote, "We are made better human beings by the fact that you have reached out from across the seas to say that we too, the rebels, the fugitives, the prisoners, deserve to be heard," end quote. Canada's fight and involvement stretched over 3 decades, notably from when the then Prime Minister, Diefenbaker, made his stance known at the Commonwealth. That was in 1961. Diefenbaker told the gathering that Canadians as a whole unequivocally deplore the practice of apartheid and believe that the principles of equality without regard to race or any other considerations must be generally acceptable to all the member nations. An impasse ensued whereby Mr. Diefenbaker proposed that instead of rejecting South Africa, they declare racial equality an essential principle of the Commonwealth. This angle saw South Africa's application being rejected. We recognize also the efforts of your former prime ministers like Clark, Maruloni, and Trudeau. Clark often engaged with the anti-apartheid movements in South Africa in enforcing sanctions. In the 1980s, Prime Minister Trudeau reaffirmed Canada's opposition to apartheid, saying that racial discrimination was an insult to mankind and could not be acceptable. The South African presidency acknowledged that Prime Minister Maruloni's firm anti-apartheid stance at times put him at odds with British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. After a particularly critical 1986 meeting in London, which left an isolated British on the sidelines, Canada moved with other Commonwealth nations on 11 additional sanctions, such as bans on new airlines, bans on new investment, and bans on the promotion of tourism to the country. Even after the release of political prisoners, now under Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, Canada ensured that sanctions were not lifted until just before the first democratic elections. In 2004, Mandela sent a letter in which he said Maroni had provided strong and principled leadership in the struggle against apartheid. He also said this was not a particular popular position in all quarters, but South Africans today acknowledge the importance of his contribution to South Africa's eventual liberation and success. As a symbol of our appreciation to Canadians, the South African government awarded former Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney with the Order of the Companion of O.R. Tambo in gold. That was in 2015, December. So it was through the efforts of your ethical leadership, whose strong moral convictions helped dismantle the formal system of apartheid. The early 1990s saw political parties opposing apartheid unbanned. Political prisoners like Walter Sisulu, Nelson Mandela, Govan Mbeki, Ahmed Kathrada were released. Exiled politicians like O.R. Tambo, Joe Slovo, Dennis Goldberg, Frini Junwala, Ruth Mampati made their way back home. Negotiations started. South Africans of all races engaged one another, not in a battle of gunfire, but in a battle of words. The remarkable thing about the negotiations for our freedom is perhaps that the solutions came from within. If a country's citizens are disagreeing in today's world, it is not common for external powers to swoop in and prescribe or even enforce. This was not the case with our negotiations. While we had many international friends who we knew we could call on, the parties in South Africa sat down, the oppressed and the oppressor, and we painstakingly talked our way to freedom. The arrival of democracy in South Africa shines as an example of the strength of dialogue, but so too does South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation of 1996, an attempt to heal the wounds of centuries of colonialism and decades of apartheid by seeking answers to painful questions and granting amnesty in exchange. That, ladies and gentlemen, was about 2 million years of our history in a few minutes. We have a divided past, which we overcame. We overcame it through negotiations to realize a democratic society. It's been 23 years of democracy. Where are we today? Was reconciliation the end goal? Should we not instead have focused on economic transformation? Did the end of apartheid lead to the end of economic segregation? Do all in our economy have the same likelihood of succeeding? Has the economic playing field been leveled? Those are the questions we ask ourselves. South Africa's Commission for Employment Equity reports that despite only making up 9.5% of the economically active population today, white South Africans still occupy 69% of top management positions and 58% of senior management positions. Let me repeat. 9% occupies 69% of top management positions and 58% of senior management positions. Looking at the gender disparity is also sobering. Males occupy 78% of top management and 67% of senior management. Statistics South Africa's Labour Force Survey for the first quarter of 2017 tells us that the unemployment rate for Black South Africans is 31%. For the white population group in South Africa, it is 6.6%, and I'm told that coincidentally, this is the exact figure for unemployment rate here in Canada. That was in May 2017, 6.6%. Now, building a unified South Africa. Should Canada continue to play a role in building a unified South Africa? And if so, what should this role be? In addressing the first question, the answer is informed again by the philosophy of Ubuntu. We are all interrelated, and what impacts on one impacts on another. Let's look at government. Canada, given its deep engagement in the fight against apartheid, ought to understand how entrenched the system was. You will understand that democracy only addressed one layer of the apartheid system, that of colonialism. We are yet to address racial oppression in the form of classification and hierarchy, which still exists. And the hierarchy is whites, Indians, coloreds, and blacks, in that order. We have not touched that topic. The obdurate nature of racism and privilege still thwarts real transformation in South Africa. The poor and Black of South Africa largely live and function outside of the formal economy. They have virtually no access to the marketplace. Jobs for poor Black South Africans are few, and they offer slave wages. This is the layer in which we invite Canada to partner with us in addressing. Canada, we acknowledge and appreciate the role that you played in ending apartheid. The fight continues. As we roll our sleeves, we need you to partner with us, as this country still has an important role to play. Something has to change, and it appears that Canada is listening. In this vein, we recognize and welcome Canada's new Feminist International Assistance Program. While South Africa has made positive strides in this area, Black women are still the most marginalized in South Africa. We respect and appreciate Canada's commitment to aiding countries that are battling with climate change. We are optimistic about the pending Development Funding Institute. From South Africa's side, we welcome all of this, but we would welcome even more a policy that is explicitly focused on boosting trade and investment with Africa. True mutually beneficial economic engagement can lift our people from the vicious circle of poverty. We are not looking for handouts, but we want to trade as partners. There is a strong business case for investing in South Africa. We have world-class infrastructure. Our legal system is resilient. Our financial system is one of the most sophisticated in the world, and our natural resource endowment is incredible. We are asking for partnerships. Canadian economic interests could be served by considering South Africa and Africa as viable economic partners. We need Canada to continue supporting our regional integration efforts. This will assist in boosting intra-African trade. We need to realize the aspirations we want as reflected on the Africa Agenda 2063, also reflected in African Union's vision, where we want to find ourselves. Canada's global trade patterns show that the entire Africa accounts for just 1% of this total. Together, we can work towards fixing this. In a globe where fears of economic protectionism are rife and long-standing trade relationships are uncertain, Africa is inviting and open for business. Sure, our business environments might be different, but this is true of any new markets. Investors from other countries are fanning out across the continent at a rapid pace. The time for first mover advantage is nearly over. Canada cannot linger. It needs to race to Africa. Let's look at the society. That was government. What about the society? The economy is not the only area we need to correct. Incidences of violence and terrorism are appalling wherever they occur in the world. But in Africa, they are often referred to as killing fields, as in this piece that you see from the Diplomat and International Canada magazine. In other parts of the world, there is often talk of lone wolves. It would be very strange to see a headline that takes an isolated, horrific incident in a tourist hotspot and generalizes it to the entire North American continent. But I'm at a loss for words when I see the headlines like this one from Globe and Mail, "Terror drives Canadians out of Africa." I want to be clear. We fully recognize and respect the freedom of the press. We are asking for ethical and professional reporting. And what defines ethical? I'll use some words of the Canadian Association of Journalists' ethical guidelines. We avoid stereotypes of race, ethnicity, geography, and we take particular care in crime stories. Using the association's own guidelines, I cannot fathom how it is acceptable to generalize an incident in one city to an entire country. This is illogical. To generalize it from one city to an entire continent is, well, it's absurd. Somewhere in the honorable field of journalism, whether through actions of journalists or sub-editors or editors, there is a professional misconduct. When such ignorant headlines occur, this is not just or ethical. This shows a lack of understanding of Africa, a continent with 55 countries, with rich, diverse cultures and languages. Until I see a headline that generalizes incidents in Quebec City, for instance, or in Las Vegas to the entire North American continent, I will have to argue that the diversity of Africa and Africans are ignored blatantly and unapologetically on a daily basis by certain segments of society. We urge societies, organizations, movements to work ethically and responsibly. As an aside, a disturbing behavior is replicated in the field of public relations. There is a widespread reportage of a large UK-based multinational firm that appears to have consciously stalked racial tensions in South Africa. We are told that slavery is over, the colonialism is over, apartheid is over, that we must not complain, we must not be apathy, as the sentiment goes. But how are we to move forward when on a daily basis our stories get clouded with words like killing fields, and PR agencies intervene in our endeavor for unity and use deplorable strategies and prey on our vulnerability to try and divide a nation? So why do we celebrate? Diverse as we are, South Africa has so much to celebrate. We celebrate our Constitution, which recognizes all human rights, which seeks to create the situation in which all South Africans shall be free from fear, including the fear of the oppression of one nation group by another, which does not define our Africanness by our race, color, gender, or historical origins. We celebrate our diversity and embrace our Africanness, be it you are a descendant of the Khoi, Zulu, Xhosa, Sotho, Pedi, European, Malay, Dutch, Indian, etc. We all agree, we are South Africans. We celebrate the negotiated settlement in which we avoided civil war. We celebrate the truth and the reconciliation efforts where we chose forgiveness. We celebrate that we can now proudly join in the family of countries of our great continent, countries where the richness of our natural resources are surpassed only by the wealth in our diversity. As I conclude, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to once again thank the organizers for this invitation. It is an honor for me to be here today. At 23 years, South Africa is still a relatively young country on the global stage. We have come a long way, but we recognize and appreciate that we, as with almost every nation on this great planet, we still have a lot to learn, and that we have a long way to go still. We also know that we do not want to find ourselves where we were about 23 years back, 25 years back, 30 years back, because we, the people of South Africa, we recognize the injustices of our past. We honor those who suffered for justice and freedom in our land. We respect those who have worked to build and develop our country, and believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity. I thank you.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner. There was quite a tour de force of an incredible history. My name is Andrew Cardozo of the Pearson Centre. My question is about what you would look to Canada for. You mentioned a few issues, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the environment and climate change. It is a major objective of the Canadian government. It's an international objective with the Paris Accord. Are there areas where we can assist or that we should be thinking about assisting, whether in terms of technology or know-how or any other aspects of climate change, helping South Africa in meeting your obligations and your interests?
Okay. Thank you so much. The good thing is that your neighbor has opened a space for Canada to take leadership in this area. You will know that Africa has committed, South Africa in particular, has committed to reduce emissions. We believe in clean energy, but we will need, for instance, that we may not have the relevant technology. Right now, we're busy at, with what is this? No. The shell gas, but in the Karoo. But we need Canada. We know you are very good in terms of shell gas extraction. So if, for instance, because what we need more than anything, we need to get that expertise. We're looking at, for instance, bringing our young ones, our students, to come and learn more about, the extraction. That is one. But also, South Africa is looking at not just one source of energy. We are looking at mixed energy. So we will look at Canada to say, where do you, what are your specialty areas? Where can South Africa come and learn? And if there is any way that Canada can assist with the current or the existing, for instance, energy sources where we can reduce emissions as well, that would be appreciated. So more than anything, we are looking for partnerships, but also we are looking for training institutions, universities, where we can bring our people to learn more about the technologies that Canada has to help us to improve in terms of the gas emissions and energy.
According to you, the negotiations for freedom was undertaken by yourselves. At the end of the day, we find the structure you've given us that the blacks continue to remain at the bottom. Would you say that those who were involved in the negotiations did a good job?
Yes. At that time, what was very critical and very important is that we didn't want any bloodshed. That was very, very important. For those of you who did watch or who did follow the negotiations, you will recall that there was some, there was an attempt of trying to destabilize the negotiations. So we had to give and take. But it's true, when we wanted to make peace and to try and make sure that there is no civil war, we may have not, or we may have overlooked other things. The system of apartheid was so entrenched that, like an iron, we're trying to peel. Some of the things that we have to look at are things that, like I'm saying, the hierarchy. We do need to address that. We have not even started addressing the hierarchy. We only looked at saying we want our freedom, we want our country back. But there is more, the economy we don't have. When it comes to, for instance, women leadership in South Africa, I must say that the government of South Africa has done very, very well. We have done so much better than even some of the Western countries. We are almost leading. Rwanda, I think, is leading when it comes to women leaders in parliament and government. And South Africa is in the top 5 or top 10, but we are doing very well. So there are still areas which we still need to address. And we are saying where we are going to need help, for instance, from Canada to address those areas, we have to speak to the relevant parties to come and work with us. But we are going to address them. South Africa is going to address them.
Elise Piquet, former academic. I was, in fact, an academic in this university, but more so in the University of Ottawa and in the States in Stanford. When I saw the information for your teacher-pupil ratio, comparing that the whites were 1 to 18 and the blacks were 1 to 39. It brought to mind something that a lot of people in this room may not know about Canada. In fact, I don't know if there are that many French Canadians in this room who are my age. One. Okay. In 1957, we started in Quebec the Quiet Revolution. I started to school, grade 1, a few years before that. When I arrived in school, our ratio was 1 to 40. 1 to 40. We had no gym, no lab, no yard. We had to clean the rooms, no cafeteria, no library, and the good ones were asked to stay after school to teach the slow ones because the nuns could not cope. Duplessis era, the Catholic institutions and Duplessis ran the system. I think it's important for foreigners who come here and who think our Canadian system is so ideal, and we have referred a lot to First Nations, and I'm very involved with First Nations groups and trying to help them bridge the gap and also recognize their own nationhood and applaud our diversity. But Canadians, French Canadians, founding nations in this country, 50 years ago, 1957, Duplessis died in 1959. I was at his funeral. That was the situation. Obviously, it's not comparable to South Africa, but it's important to know and recognize and understand. Canada has also come a long way. And I'm telling you that in English, so I had to become an Anglophone in a way to survive and do quite well. Go to school a long time. 1 to 40. I was in the classroom, in fact, when there were 47 students. And I could hardly follow because I was often asked to teach them as a kid of 7 or 8 or 9.
I'm Ambassador Garcia from the Philippines. I served in South Africa during the from 95 to 97. So at that time, you had in place affirmative action in order to address this situation. So I'm very interested to know how that has panned out, whether it has improved this inequality in the economic distribution that you talked about. Just your views, your general views on affirmative action, and whether it has made it more equal between, made it fairer, the jobs. Were you able to give more jobs to the blacks who compose most of the population as against the whites? Thank you.
The sad part about affirmative action is that, yes, you may find a lot of women, for instance, in the workplace, but there are receptionists in HR, communications, but in the lower ranks, lower levels. And like I indicated, because of the way the apartheid system was entrenched, some or most of the black people do not have the skills or the qualifications to take part into the in the economy. For instance, if you were to talk mine managers, it's mainly white males. If you were to talk, I get still today, if a pilot is a black person, that it still comes as a shock, whether black female or black male. So the affirmative action, while it's good, but it can only address the lower, if I can put it that way, the lower levels. Now, when it comes to the affirmative action in terms of business, we have found that, for instance, you will find companies fronting fronting is they will try and beat the system by bringing in their maids as a partner, and the maid who doesn't understand business at all, but has her name as a shareholder, but never receives even a cent. So we are facing those challenges where companies are trying to beat the system. They do everything in their power to build the system. They go to even an extent whereby when they are supposed to partner with the communities, they will divide the communities. Because if you have been for a very long time, if you have been without and somebody gives you $1 million, you want to take the $1 million and you don't think about creating wealth. You want to go and run and buy yourself a car. Because we have not been educated, skilled, be informed about creating wealth. All you know is that I have to go and buy bread now. I have to buy a car now. And you forget that this 1 million over a 20-year, business that is going to generate more and more for your family. You just don't think that far. So those are the things that we need to address. So the affirmative action, while it's there, we found that companies have been able to beat the system to somehow, we just have to find better ways of making sure that it's implemented correctly.
Your Excellency, thank you so kindly for your empowering and enlightening presentation. You mentioned briefly about the role of women. Oh, my name is Marie Edith Sandville, your servant. Thank you. You mentioned briefly about the role of women in government and the role of women in general within your country. Would you be so kind to tell us a little bit more about strategic plans that are being put forth to see more women in management, more women in government, girls? Right now in Canada, in the world, we're celebrating October is Women's Month. Are there strategic plans in place to ensure continuity for women to progress?
Thank you. South Africa, I must say, especially government, we really pushing that women, because women previously they were their place it was in more is to be in the kitchen, but we are promoting women leadership. If you were to look at government, for instance, about 40-something percent, is it 39 or 40-something, around 40-something percent, we have women in parliament. Even in politics, we have had women who are starting their political parties, some are leaders in some political parties. So government has policies in place which ensure that women are given, they are now given space. They are given space to be leaders. The only challenge that we still have is in the private sector. Perhaps with the private sector, it could be because the legislation is mainly in the private sector, and there is nothing that forces the private sector. So the private sector is not doing well. But with the state-owned entities and with government, there is a lot of improvement around. There are policies that are being put in place. There are strategies that are put in place to advance women leadership.
Thank you.
Including the affirmative action that the lady just spoke about.
Thank you.
Your Excellency, thank you very much for this most powerful intervention this evening. The rapt attention with which the audience listened to you should have been an indication that you were really, you had captured our interest and captured our hearts as we listened to your presentation. very quickly, if I allow me, I'd like to make a few points on on this. Part of it is to pick up on a point that was made very early in one of the first question. The first question was the notion of partnership on specific sets of issues. And that is something that I hope your government and the government of my country will be looking to develop over the years, areas where, as important, perhaps this is self-important, but important players on now the world stage, I think it would be important to find areas where we would agree, we would have a common perception, we would see outcomes in the same area. The example of climate change was given, where I think that is something that, where it is possible to work together quite clearly. The other thing which I would have, I hope you can explore in your stay with us is how Canada's feminist international assistance policy can actually be a tool to help the development, the priorities of addressing issues in South Africa, but around the world as well. This is a policy that the Canadian government has undertaken to pursue out of its own interests. How can we then marry that with interests of other countries? Conversations, I think, will be important on that point. The last point I want to make, because you're not here to listen to me, is it was refreshing living in a democracy to see that Canada's commitment to the movement against apartheid was in fact breached political bounds in Canada. This is something on which it is, as you saw, deeply felt in the Canadian population. It is part of who we are. It has articulated itself in all of our major political parties in the country. And that is something that, while I'm not saying that Canada has that as a Canadian, I am proud of our achievements in that area, understanding that, as you put it, the fight continues. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So on behalf of everyone, this is the tradition of this. We present you with your poster. And so I think, right, and if you can turn around.